Ex-wife and friends laughed as Richard Hale's world collapsed. A man who once stood untouchable, admired for his sharp mind and unshakable confidence, watched his life burn to the ground. One terrible night turned everything he'd built into smoke and ashes. And when the dust settled, betrayal came fast. His wife filed for divorce without a blink, and the friends who once toasted his success mocked him from afar. Whispers spread through boardrooms and cafes. Richard's finished. But in the wreckage, one figure remained. Not a powerful ally, not a business partner, but Margaret, the aging nanny who had raised his daughter as if she were her own. She welcomed Richard and little Ella into her modest home without hesitation. From sleeping on a creaky guest bed to clawing his way back toward the life he'd lost, Richard's story wasn't just about rebuilding an empire. It was about uncovering the one truth that would silence every laugh aimed at his fall. Before we dive in, make sure you hit that subscribe button. Your support lets us keep sharing stories like this, stories about grit, heartbreak, and redemption. Richard Hale wasn't the kind of man you could ignore. For years, his name echoed through deal rooms and high society parties. He had a presence that made people straighten their posture the moment he walked in. It wasn't only his wealth. It was the way he carried himself as though defeat could never find him. But life has a cruel way of reminding even the strongest that no one is untouchable. It began on an ordinary evening. The Hale estate, a grand mansion framed by pristine lawns and polished cars lined up like trophies, was alive with laughter. Inside, Victoria, his elegant wife, mingled with her polished circle. Crystal glasses clinked, expensive perfume mingled with candlelight, and their daughter Ella dashed down the marble corridor, her giggles rising to the ceiling. Then came the smell. Faint, almost easy to dismiss at first, a strange tang wafting in from the east wing. Seconds later, alarms shrieked, tearing through the night. Fire exploded with a terrifying roar. Flames devoured velvet drapes. Chandeliers shattered. Priceless paintings curled and blackened. Chaos surged through the halls as guests screamed and stumbled over one another. Richard fought through choking smoke, heart hammering, until he found Ella, coughing and terrified. He wrapped her tiny hand in his, guiding her through heat and falling debris, his face slick with sweat and soot. By sunrise, the estate was nothing more than a smoldering carcass. Contracts, blueprints, personal treasures, gone in a single night. But what crushed him wasn't just the fire. It was what followed. Within days, Victoria's lawyer delivered the divorce papers. No hesitation, no attempt at comfort. Her words still rang cold in his memory. "I didn't marry you to live in ashes." The friends who once clung to his success evaporated. In cafes downtown, whispers replaced loyalty. Two men hunched over coffee murmured, "Hale's done. Lost it all. Guess money was the only thing holding people close." The gossip followed him everywhere, in corridors, lobbies, even in the pitying eyes of strangers. Every word cut deeper than any flame. But amid the ruins, Margaret stood firm. Her hair silvered, her hands lined with years of service, she stepped forward when everyone else stepped back. While banks froze his accounts and courts tangled his name, she opened her weathered front door and said softly, "You and Ella will always have a home here." From gleaming marble floors to a narrow guest room scented faintly of lavender and old books, Richard and Ella began again under her roof. The fall was merciless, but as Richard sat on the edge of a worn bed, head in his hands, a surprising feeling crept in, something he hadn't known for years, a quiet, fragile sense of safety. His empire was dust. His marriage had crumbled in a single breath. Friends who once toasted his victories now melted into the background, as if he'd never existed. Yet, that night, as Margaret tucked Ella beneath a faded quilt, humming the same gentle lullaby she'd sung since the child's first days, Richard felt an unexpected truth. He wasn't completely alone. The fire had stripped him bare, but it had also revealed the rare few who stayed when the smoke cleared. Life inside Margaret's cottage was a world apart from the palace he used to command. The kitchen table bore scars from years of chopping vegetables. The wallpaper had yellowed with time, curling at the corners. At night, the wind rattled loose panes in their frames. To Ella, it felt safe, a place where the storm outside couldn't touch her. To Richard, every creak and shadow whispered of how far he had fallen. Dawn arrived early. He'd sit slouched at that scarred table, the same wrinkled shirt hanging from his shoulders, for days. Blank paper stared back at him as he tried to scribble plans for a comeback. His fingers, once steady as they signed deals worth millions, now trembled so badly he could hardly write a shopping list. Margaret noticed everything. Without a word, she would slide a steaming mug beside him, mint-scented tea cutting through the heavy silence. When he ventured into town, the whispers trailed close behind. "Isn't that Richard Hale?" someone murmured near the market stalls. "Looks different without the tailored suits. Poor man. Shows how fast money disappears." One chilly afternoon, carrying nothing but bread and milk in a paper sack, Richard crossed paths with a man who had once shared his champagne toasts. The man didn't even offer a greeting, just a thin smirk, followed by a low jab meant to wound. From billionaire to beggar. "Didn't see that coming." Richard's jaw clenched. 100 sharp retorts crowded his tongue, but he said nothing. He simply tightened his grip, the milk sloshing inside the bag, and walked on, heat rising to his face. At home, Ella sometimes found him staring at the floor, shoulders slumped as though carrying a mountain. She would slip her small hand into his and whisper, "Daddy, will we be okay?" He'd summon a smile, soft but uncertain, and nod. Deep down, even he didn't know the answer. Margaret, however, never doubted. When Richard hesitated to accept small consulting jobs, work that paid less in a month than he'd once spent on dinner, she rested a gentle hand on his arm. "Pride won't feed Ella," she said. "Start here, build." So he did. Nights stretched long at Margaret's ancient wooden desk, a flickering lamp casting tired shadows as Richard scribbled strategies on recycled sheets. Sometimes Ella would doze on the couch nearby, and Margaret would drape a blanket over her, glancing at Richard with quiet encouragement. Progress was slow, almost invisible. Each step forward felt heavier than the last, but brick by brick he began to rise, not with crowds cheering, but with a stubborn fire born from shame and grit. And as he watched Margaret moving about her modest kitchen, the scent of stew filling the room, something unfamiliar stirred in his chest. Gratitude. She never asked for repayment, never reminded him of the man he'd once been. She simply believed. It was fragile, a faint light after so much darkness, but it was light all the same. And time, Richard discovered, has a way of testing what's real. Within Margaret's quiet home, a rhythm took root. He accepted any honest work he could find, consulting for tiny firms, drafting proposals in cramped cafes, mentoring eager young entrepreneurs who barely knew his name. At first, the humility stung, but every project honed his skills, sharpening instincts dulled by loss. Many nights ended with him hunched over the battered desk, papers spread wide like the blueprints of a war he intended to win. Ella would peek from the doorway, her hair messy from sleep, and whisper, "Don't stay up too late, Daddy," before curling back under her blanket. Margaret, steady as ever, would slide a plate of warm food beside him and slip out without a word. The nights stretched on, but the silence in that small house was no longer heavy. It was steady, a quiet rhythm against which Richard rebuilt his life. Years passed. Those rough sketches turned into signed contracts. Contracts grew into ventures. Ventures bloomed into something far larger, a company born from grit, leaner and sharper than the empire he'd once lost. Soon, whispers began swirling again, but this time their notes were different. At the same cafe where strangers once sneered, two men now leaned close, their voices hushed. "Is that Richard Hale?" one said. "Didn't think he'd claw his way back." The other shook his head. "Not just back. Heard he landed a deal bigger than half the firms in the city." Richard kept his face neutral, sipping his coffee. But inside, a slow, steady fire burned. With every win, Ella's laughter rang clearer, a melody of hope filling Margaret's modest kitchen. And Margaret herself watched with a quiet pride as father and daughter reclaimed more than wealth. They reclaimed themselves. Yet Richard was different now. The man who once chased applause moved with a calm strength, unshaken by praise or scorn. That's when they returned, the so-called friends, drifting back with smiles too wide, compliments too sweet. At a glittering gala, Richard found himself surrounded by familiar faces eager to bask in his shine. Then, through the crowd, Victoria approached, elegant, poised, her perfume wrapping the air like a memory. "Richard," she breathed, voice dipped in false regret. "Perhaps we moved too fast. Maybe we could try again?" For a heartbeat, the room blurred. He saw divorce papers on crisp white paper, her cold stare across a courtroom, the way she turned away when his world burned. But this time, Richard didn't plead. He didn't explain. He simply met her eyes and said, calm and certain, "No." The room went still. Victoria's smile wavered, fragile as glass, but Richard had already turned away. For the first time in years, he wasn't reaching for approval. He was the proof of what strength looked like. Across the room, Margaret watched, quiet but knowing. This was only the beginning. Success, however, casts long shadows. As Richard's company climbed headlines, new whispers began, no longer mocking, but probing. How had he risen so fast? How had a man ruined by fire built something untouchable? Richard ignored most of it until an investigator, a man who had followed his story since that night, slid into a seat across from him at a dim cafe. A thin envelope crossed the table, trembling in cautious hands. "You need to see this," the man said. Inside lay charred papers, blurred signatures, property deeds altered with care, and photographs. Victoria's name on forged insurance claims, legal documents doctored to the last detail. A trail that led not to chance, but to betrayal. Richard sat frozen, heart thudding against his ribs. The blaze that stole everything hadn't been fate. It had been lit, planned, signed, and sealed by the woman he'd once sworn to love. The divorce, the lawsuits, the missing records. All pieces in a scheme meant to leave him broken. That night, Richard didn't sleep. He paced Margaret's living room, the old floorboards sighing beneath his steps. Margaret set her knitting aside, her wise eyes fixed on him. When she finally spoke, her voice was low but steady. "You carried the blame all these years, Richard," she said. "But now you see, it was never your failure." Dawn broke with flashing red and blue. Victoria's grand gates glowed under police lights as neighbors pressed against their curtains, trying to glimpse the fall of a woman who once ruled the city's glittering nights. Officers led her out, wrists cuffed, past the marble steps she had guarded so proudly, and as always, the whispers bloomed. Two women paused with their shopping bags, eyes wide. "Is that Victoria Hale?" one hissed. After all those years thinking she was untouchable, look at her now. News of her arrest streaked through the city like a storm. The same socialites who once toasted her in candlelit ballrooms deleted her number. Business partners scrambled to cut ties. Her carefully built illusion crumbled. Faster, sharper than Richard's world had ever collapsed. But Richard didn't gloat. He didn't even go to watch. To him, her downfall wasn't a trophy. It was quiet proof. Evidence that the years of ridicule and the long nights blaming himself had never belonged on his shoulders. That evening, as he tucked Ella beneath a soft blanket and watched Margaret smooth the edges with patient hands, something settled inside him. It wasn't triumph. It was release. The ghosts born from fire and betrayal no longer stalked him. He was free. Days later, a press room buzzed with energy. Cameras flashed, microphones jostled like weapons, reporters called his name, chasing a headline. Richard stepped to the podium, tailored suit immaculate, posture commanding. But his eyes held something weightier than success. They held the story of scars, nights without hope, and the people who made survival possible. He spoke slowly, voice steady, each word landing like a stone in still water. "No one believed in me," he began, pausing as silence rippled across the room. "Not my friends, not even myself." He let the words hang, then continued softer. "But one woman did. When the fire stole everything, when the laughter cut deeper than flames, she opened her door." She believed in me, and she loved my daughter as her own. She never asked for money, never cared about my failures. She became the mother I wish I'd had. Cameras clicked furiously. Reporters scribbled, but Richard wasn't speaking for them. His gaze drifted to the back of the hall, where Margaret stood half-hidden, hands folded, tears bright in her eyes. Beside her, Ella clung to her arm, face alight with pride. The billionaire they wanted to celebrate had turned the spotlight on someone who never sought it. In that moment, Margaret wasn't just the nanny. She was the anchor who had steadied a man through fire and ruin. Applause rose, filling the room like a wave. Richard stepped away from the podium, ignoring the cameras chasing him. He crossed the floor and wrapped Margaret in a firm embrace for the whole world to see. For once, the headlines weren't about fortunes lost or empires rebuilt. They were about gratitude, family, and the quiet power of loyalty. Richard had regained wealth, but his greatest treasure stood right beside him. That was the truth his journey had carved. Money can vanish, friends can scatter, even love can betray. But genuine loyalty never fades. Often the one the world overlooks is the person holding you together. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who needs a reminder. Real wealth isn't counted in what we own, but in who stands beside us when everything else has burned away.